Kaimere is a distant planet. It is defined by waves of life brought from Earth and set free to evolve independently in this new context. The indigenous life of the planet, swarms of microbes called magic by the people who live there, are what harvest Earth organisms and make copies on Kaimere. At many periods, this planet has undergone what Kaimere naturalists call dynasties, where an ecosystem is stable and the portal does not perform these harvests as it has no need to repopulate. In these dynasties, biodiversity tends to be low, but populations are large and healthy. Once something cataclysmic occurs, be it intense aridity, meteor impact, or volcanic activity, the territory of the portal is decimated and turns to its satellites on Earth to harvest more flora and fauna. This interim between stable dynasties is called a Dark Age by Chimeran historians, and is defined by high species diversity and turnover, often because the very harvests meant to stabilize the region bring an influx of invasive species and diseases. Dark Ages can last for many millions of years. Some consider Kaimere to be presently in a Dark Age, yet others argue that the Megaraptoran dynasty began around 6 million years ago, and while the known world has had many harvests, the planet overall has been quite stable since this time. The first dynasty was defined by a range of Devonian fauna and their descendants. The Permian dynasty was, with a length of almost 70 million years, the longest dynasty. 2 Jurassic and 2 early Cretaceous dynasties each lasted for shorter periods of time. The second of the early Cretaceous dynasties ended with a devastating arid period which cleared many of the rainforests. Tyrannosaurs were the defining members of this dynasty, and managed to endure in fringe habitats, but most of the smaller ornithopods and theropods which had hunted them were driven to endangerment or extinction. The eastern continent of Kairul seems to have been less impacted by this climactic shift, but the region of Nikar around the portal was hit especially hard. In response to this, the Great Portal harvested from East Asia. The harvest brought a range of new taxa, many of which were quite comfortable in the arid climate. New species of Hadrosaur, Tyrannosaur, ceratopsian, dromaeosaur, ankylosaur, therizinosaur, titanosaur, ornithomimosaur as darkid, and many others were harvested in appreciable numbers. It did not take long for them to settle in and spread out, and after a few more harvests from the same region and time, these dinosaurs dominated Nikar and had spread throughout much of Kairul. As the climate recovered, some of the indigenous taxa integrated into this new ecosystem, but on these 2 continents, the new taxa generally dominated. The Tyrant dynasty lasted for over 50 million years. New clades evolved and diversified, but with a single exception of Earth's early Oligocene, there was no need to harvest as the biodiversity and density was healthy, steady, and reliable. Toward the end of their dynasty, most clades had a few species whose juveniles had outcompeted their smaller relatives. Placental mammals harvested from the Oligocene, indigenous multituberculates, and a few small generalists like Megaraptorans, Thescelosaurs, Elasmarians, Abelisaurs, and Eudromaeosaurs all waited in the proverbial wings, eking out a living and doing their best in deserts or temperate zones. Fern prairies and open conifer forests dominated the terrestrial habitats in the primarily tropical continents, and most of the Tyrant dynasty, the climate was humid and supported a vast quantity of megafauna. In the continents of the known world, which at the time included Nikar of the eastern continent of Kairul, the apex predators were Tyrannosaurs. However, it was not a consistent lineage, and Chimeran paleontologists recognize 3 epochs built around which of these tyrants was king. During the first epoch, Tarbosaurians, descended from animals like Tarbosaurus and Zhucheng tyrannus, were the top predators of both continents. Carcharodontosaurs held on, mostly in tropical forests as titan specialists, but they steadily declined over this epoch. Alioramines and a clade of gracile neotenic tarbosaurians vied for the mesopredator niche alongside juveniles of the dominant tarbosaurians. Towards the end of this epoch, Alioramines got larger and more socially complex, and they outcompeted Carcharodontosaurs of both continents. The Middle Epoch was defined by a decline in the robust Tarbosaurians and replacement by robust Alioramines. These new tyrants were far less violent, and adults had a range of keratin and fleshy, caruncled displays. It is not known why these Alioramines displaced the Tarbosaurians, but this priority of visual intimidation over physical engagement seems to have been a factor, perhaps resulting in an ecological dominance, despite the Tarbosaurians besting them in direct encounters thanks to far more combat experience. Shortly after the ascension of the robust Alioramines, the robust Tarbosaurians went extinct, leaving only the neotenic Tarbosaurians to carry on the legacy of the old kings. The third epoch of the Tyrant dynasty saw the return of the Tarbosaurians to dominance with the genus Omegatyrannus, which assumed a robust body plan of their ancestors. They were specialized for prey, which was quite successful at the time, and the Alioramines of this epoch were either pressured to specialization like Titan hunters or armored game specialists. One group evolved especially pronounced teeth at the end of their maxilla, earning them the title saber-toothed tyrants by the assembly paleontologists. While the Tyrant dynasty is named after these apex predators, the defining and keystone clade of the era were the Hadrosaurs and their vast nesting colonies. Several lineages of saurolophine hadrosaurs came to dominance and had high turnover, but the clade overall was cosmopolitan in its distribution. They generally share a basic body plan and varied little from their ancestors in appearance. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, as they say. During the last 10 million years or so, a genus called Agricolasaurus had nesting colonies on both continents, dominating forests and fern prairies. Agricolasaurus was, despite its name, not a farmer, but did cultivate lands around their nests with their dung and seeds brought from foraging. Unlike other species, they were not particularly migratory, although males dispersed far and wide, which is why the species designation is rarely considered in studies of these animals, as they could all fairly easily breed with one another. Eggs took around 6 months to incubate, and they did not have a regular nesting season, so it was critical to defend the region year-round. Although they foraged many miles outside the colony so as not to deplete their land, their droppings within the colony were perfect for growing cycads, horsetails, and ferns that their young needed once they outgrew crop milk. Young remained with their parents for many years, and it was their duty to protect their little siblings from nest raiders. These yearlings in turn were defended by subadults and mothers from the mesopredators that looked on the fringes of the colony. A number of unrelated bulls defended the herd, led by a patriarch, who kept the younger bulls in line. While most adults peaked at around 10 to 15 tons, a patriarch could weigh up to 25 tons in the largest species and would fend off predators who might threaten his herd. Their ultimate guardian, however, came in perhaps an unexpected form: the queen. At 50 feet long and weighing up to 20 tons, the resident female tyrannosaurs of the genus Omegatyrannus were the largest theropods to evolve until that time, and would only be surpassed by modern Kurujaku because of its aquatic lifestyle. Most adults of this genus were more moderate 10 to 12 tons, not dramatically different from other tyrannosaurs before them. The territory of resident males and Baroness tyrants were usually established around rivers or optimal habitat from a wide range of prey, but only the largest and most dominant females could hope to become a queen. In order to assume this title, a female would first need to endure the violent trials of adolescence, battling their way towards a generalist barony territory, and only if they got enough food during the critical growth spurt stage, they could develop the skeletal framework to challenge a queen from a colony and become its ruler, a title she might hold for up to 3 decades. While overseeing the colony, the queen took on a farmer's role. She knew every individual in her herd, sometimes even patrolling in their midst. The herd knew their queen and knew she would not attack them unless there was some sign of weakness, as much of her kills were of injured or old individuals, or when she was hunting, which took place outside of the colony. Members of her herd were sometimes the target of these hunts beyond the colony, but not always. Much of her hunts were of other prey species and even other tyrants that might come too close. In this way, Hadrosaurs and Tyrannosaurs became deeply reliant on one another. Approaching the size of these great queens were transient males. These were much larger than territorial resident males, with their long strides affording them efficient travel. The largest of these could weigh 15 tons. They wandered the land of these two continents, living a life of feast and famine. The wanderings of these males, much like the patriarch Hadrosaurs, kept the genus fairly similar throughout the era, which many naturalists believe may have led to fairly specialized uniformity, which could have left them vulnerable. Their unchallenged dominance led to an extinction of most generalist tyrants and hadrosaurs on the continents. Omega Tyrannus and Agricolasaurus led the charge to making their respective families victims of their own success. While the dynamic of the tyrants and hadrosaurs was a defining feature of this dynasty, especially in the tropics, there were many other generalists, both predators like the gracile tyrants and dromies, the herbivores from a wide range of clades. However, they were kept on the ecological fringes, with the last epoch of the Tyrant dynasty seeing an increased cosmopolitan uniformity of these two genera and pressuring competing clades into increased specialization. A then connected continent called the Crown of Kairul had its hadrosaurs and tyrants, but it was the temperate forests of southern Kairul which proved to be far more diverse in the absence of ruling clades. 15 million years ago, the northbound movement of Picardia, southbound movement of Nikar, and eastern shift of Arvel's continental plate resulted in the confluence of volcanic activity which seems to have culminated in a brief yet apocalyptic window of time. Winds carried the ash northwest and southeast, coating most of the tropics and southern temperate zone in desolation, especially the known world. Few tropical fauna of the known world survived this initial impact. The portal itself only endured by shifting southward to avoid the ash, settling in its modern region. Smaller-scale eruptions continued over the next centuries, and Kaimere became a wasteland, with few indigenous fauna of the known world surviving. Picardia was struck especially hard, and though Kairul was better off, its context had changed enough that the tyrants and hadrosaurs struggled to adapt. As victims of their own specialized success, they were outcompeted by smaller, more flexible generalists. Eventually, the volcanic activity settled down, and the ash which had brought so much death proved to be a nutrient-rich Eden for ecological rebirth. With the southbound trade winds keeping away the ash, the temperate Crown of Kairul was spared the worst of this devastation. It was from here that the diverse cast of smaller generalists moved south to populate the now verdant jungles and prairies of the tropical continents. Southwestern Arvel was also below the tropical ridge latitudes, and many species from this then forested sanctuary also colonized the New World. Thescelosaurs, a clade of small burrowing dinosaurs, had survived the impact with minimal casualties and rapidly spread and diversified. In modern Kaimere and Kairul, they are among the most widespread and successful terrestrial megafauna. The animals which populated the new habitat all underwent dramatic adaptive radiations, as most of these tropical niches were open. After a dormancy of nearly 1 million years, likely due to losing a majority of its organisms and having to relocate to the south, the Great Portal began a new cycle of harvest. With this act, a whole new source of flora and fauna was introduced. The confluence of fauna from Nikar, Picardia, Arvel, and Earth resulted in an unprecedented level of biodiversity and level of competitive niche partitioning which continues to define the known world to this day. The great tyrants are gone, but their legacy remains in fossils scattered throughout the known world and is survived in such species as the Arvelith nehamu, the last Alioramine, and the Gurkhan, a small hadrosaur found in the prairies north of the known world. The archetypical members of the Tyrant dynasty shaped their world and defined an era, but as so often occurs, their specialized success was ultimately their downfall, and it was the humble generalists in their shadows who ultimately inherited the continents of the known world. The rise and collapse of the Tyrant dynasty can be seen as a lesson in understanding that success and dominance are often inextricably tied to one's context, and becoming too specialized and prevailing can ultimately result in a species' demise once the setting changes. No context lasts forever, and while investing in a uniform lifestyle can lead to short-term success, it almost inevitably comes to a devastating conclusion. Cheers to David for sponsoring this episode. Although the Tyrant dynasty is distant prehistory, it is very important in setting the stage for modern Kaimere, so it was exciting to unpack to a greater depth as a focal episode. When I first conceived of Kaimere back in middle school, this planet was populated by a lot of my favorite dinosaurs, like T-Rex, Triceratops, Carcharodontosaurus, Therizinosaurus, and Velociraptor. Over time, I decided I wanted to have these animals continue to evolve, as remaining in their iconic forms for so long felt like a suspension of disbelief far beyond what I wanted for this setting. I explored a range of future evolutions, typically defaulting to oversized, extreme versions of these extinct taxa. While that was a lot of fun, and I have no regrets, I have since defaulted to large derived versions of small Mesozoic generalists being the dinosaurs of the modern world. Thus my old designs became obsolete, and I decided they could represent the Tyrant dynasty that you learned about today. Although I am much more satisfied with Kaimere as it is today, I am happy that I worked so many of my old childhood concepts and designs in. That little Keenan would have been proud. I think he also would have been stoked that I finally published my second book. Tales of Kaimere, Songs of the Inland Sea is a nautical anthology of short stories and novellas. With heists on a ship that go horribly wrong, Kirut's continued adventures against a demon of frost and famine, and a survival story from the perspective of a killer whale, this anthology was a delight to put together. It took far longer than I anticipated, hence my relative inaction of late, but I'm super proud of the final product. Once my copy of the hardcover gets here, I'll start my promo episodes, but you can order your own copies through the links in the description, or by asking your local bookstore to order the listed ISBNs. Would be my personal preference to have your local bookstore get them if at all possible, and since this is published through Ingram, most of them can. Shout out to my patrons, gratitude to David for this sponsorship, thank you all again for watching, and I do hope you order and enjoy this new anthology. Cheers, folks!